Chapter 35. Into the Forest I Go. Syndicate Headquarters, Kyoto. The 14th of April, 9:07 a.m. Apologies, am I interrupting? Todoroki Shoto blinked his eyes open, slowly returning to the present. For the past 2 hours, or at least, what felt like around 2 hours, he'd been seated on his cell's cool wooden floor, legs crossed and hands clasped loosely together, immersed in another prolonged period of Zen meditation. It was a skill he'd honed considerably over the seemingly endless blur of his captivity, a way to clear his mind and relax his body. To pass his days without being consumed by endless fear of what was happening in the world outside the confines of his cage. Emptying his head of thoughts had always been the most difficult part of the process. For the first few weeks, he could scarcely pass a minute in silence without hearing Toga Himiko's shrill, manic laugh. Feeling the phantom lance of pain from her knife plunging into his back. Without picturing the faces of his friends and classmates, twisted in suffering of his mother and sister and father. By now, though, he could make it through hours of emptiness on end, his body reduced to a state of complete and total tranquility. Still, though, he could never escape his thoughts completely. Sooner or later, the same worries always returned. How many are dead by now? Shoto often found himself wondering, bitter frustration swelling in his chest. How many has Midoriya murdered? How many today? How many yesterday? How many of them could I have saved if I weren't trapped in here? If I'd been strong enough to beat Derby, quick enough to escape from Toga? There was no use to asking those questions, though, aside from punishing himself. Shoto had long since accepted that he couldn't undo his capture, and that his cell was too closely monitored to engineer his own breakout. His sole mission now was winning over the Syndicate's trust, whittling away at their suspicions until they gave him a chance to escape, and seizing that moment when it came. No matter how many lies I have to tell to get there, Shoto reminded himself, staring up into Yaoyorozu's eyes. Pandora was sporting her usual confident, self-assured smirk, her hands propped on her hips as she loomed above him. Her chin-length hair was dyed a pale, pearl-like shade of whitish pink today, aquamarine contacts in her eyes. He'd been too deep in his meditation to notice the soft hiss of hydraulic steam that announced her entry, or perhaps his mind had simply begun to filter the noise out after hearing it announce each meal and visitation for weeks on end. Regardless, Pandora's arrival marked his first high-ranking syndicate visitor in over 3 days. In the interim, he'd only had the company of Dark Shadow, Mustard, and twice, bearing food, water, and occasionally tea, if he was lucky. Of the three of them, only Bubegora was willing to strike up any conversation, though he was also quick to shut down and leave if Todoroki tried to probe him for anything beyond the most bland and innocuous topics. And here I was starting to wonder if you'd forgotten about me. Cold Flame forced a faint grin onto his face as he rose steadily to his feet. Despite all his instincts to the contrary, he had to keep up the illusion that he wanted to join, and that meant feigning interest in his captors whenever possible. Apologies if I can't say exactly how long it's been, but... Nonsense, I'm the one who owes you an apology. Shoto, without warning, Momo leaned forward and wrapped him in a tight hug. Shoto could feel the cold alloy plating of her molded silver-grey armor through the plain beige robe they'd given him, but the warmth of her body and breath swiftly followed, then the scent of her perfume, the shampoo in her hair. Rosemary, lavender, thyme. She smelled like a bouquet of all his favorite herbs, almost intoxicatingly strong. In spite of everything, though, the gesture felt strangely comforting after such a prolonged period without physical contact, and Shoto tentatively returned the embrace, resting his hands as lightly as possible on her back. We've just been so relentlessly busy lately, Yaoyorozu continued, breaking the embrace with a sigh. You wouldn't imagine the things I've had to deal with these past few days, or the setbacks we've been dealt, in spite of our progress. Not to mention all the time I've devoted to advocating your cause to the others. When you first made your case, they refused to even consider your request, but over time, I've been able to make them see reason. It was a simple matter once they set aside their natural biases. Of course, the soles of Pandora's boots clicked rhythmically on the wood as she paced back and forth across the room, her brows furrowed and her mouth turned in a slight frown. For a few brief moments, Cold Flame saw flashes of the girl he'd once known of Kriti, the brilliant, analytically minded bookworm, always putting her all into solving every problem set before her. A girl incapable of harming a fly, ceaselessly concerned for others, shockingly humble, despite her wealth of talent and skill. And again, Shoto asked himself the same question, one that had remained fixed at the front of his mind from the moment Pandora revealed herself to him. What did they do to her? But that's enough complaining from me. Yaoyo Rosa paused and turned back to face him, shaking her head apologetically. You've been waiting all this time for an answer. Yes, Shoto stammered, rapidly shifting back into his faux enthusiasm. I know it must sound crazy, but the more I think about it, the more certain I am, especially after my last conversation with Midoriya earlier this week. The syndicate is where I belong. After everything, Shoto paused for a beat, and some of the faint eagerness faded from his voice. After everything I watched my father get away with, after a lifetime watching him be rewarded and praised without any consequences for what he's done, I know something has to change. So if the system won't punish someone like him, then Seraph is right, we need to change the system. It was a mixture of truth and lies, though Shoto himself wasn't exactly certain as to the proportions. His chest still turned to a whirling torrent of conflicting emotions whenever thoughts of Todoroki Enji came to mind. What do you think? Huh? Wanna say hello to the world? Kamakiri's voice drew the room's attention back to the screen as they watched. He leaned down and pulled the hoods from his captives' heads, smirking all the while. Kurihara and Fukai's faces were both slick with sweat and streaked with dried tears, but aside from the lengths of rope gagging their mouths, they seemed unharmed at the moment. They were still dressed in their work clothes, seemingly prepped for an ordinary day. Kurihara's glasses were askew, his neatly gelled graying black hair tousled out of place and his morning stubble still unshaved. Fukai seemed to have been abducted in the midst of her pre-work routine as well, if her half-done makeup was any indication. Streaks of black eyeliner ran down from her left eye but not her right, and only one of her cheeks sported foundation and concealer. On trial today, we have two of the Commission's favorite bloodhounds. Kamakiri clapped his hands together in anticipation, two slanted blades slowly emerging from his wrists. They spent the better part of a year trying their best to smear my reputation, strip away my hero license, all because my quirk doesn't fit the Commission's bullshit image of a family-friendly, corporate-friendly hero. But this, he paused and shrugged his shoulders, gesturing towards the camera. This isn't just about me. I'm not here to sell you guys some bullshit, woe is me vanity trip about my problems. This is bigger than me, and it's bigger than them too. Kamakiri shifted his boot to Kurihara's shoulder and pressed it down even harder, threatening to dislocate it. A scowl spread across his face as the man cried out in pain. They're not the disease, they're just a symptom of the rot that's eating this country from the inside out. And I know you all can see it too, you're not half as blind as they wish you were. But enough from me. I'll let you hear it from the dogs themselves. Running one hand through his mohawk, Toguro began to pace around the pair in a slow circle, but he quickly came to a halt before the senior of the two agents, and his grin returned. Why don't we start with you, buddy? It's like they say, age before beauty, or some shit like that. Remember, though, you gotta stay still, or my hand might slip. In one swift motion, Kamakiri crouched down and severed the man's gag. To his credit, he only flinched slightly in response. As Toguro stood again, his blades grew in size from daggers to long swords, poised to swing down and strike the agent's head off at any moment. Special Agent Kurihara Daisuke. Daisuke the demon, right? That's what they called you back when you ran with field ops. Yeah, the man stammered after a few agonizing moments, nodding his head. Some people did. And why'd they start calling you that? Kurihara's eyes narrowed, and his mouth set into a hard line. His body was still trembling, but an air of determination had settled over him. Playing the strong, silent type. A peal of laughter echoed through the dark room the stream was being filmed in, and Kamakiri shook his head in bemusement. Real brave of you, buddy. But I'm not the only one asking. Don't you think the people deserve to know what you've been up to? I mean, 13 years at the Commission, anyone would have some skeletons in the closet after that long. Let me see if I can jog your memory, though. Does the name Strike Team Valkyrie ring a bell? Kurihara's eyes widened reflexively in shock, then narrowed in frustration. I don't have to say a single goddamn thing to you, the man finally declared in a defiant tone, prompting an exaggerated sigh from Kamakiri. Off to Atilia's left, President Kengan's own brows had furrowed slightly as well. Her lips pursed in displeasure. Torture me all you want, it won't matter. You see what we're dealing with, Guys, the smallest little question about what they're doing with all that public money, and they get all rude with ya. But hey, if he doesn't want to talk to me, maybe he'll talk to my friend here. The faint sound of footsteps became audible, steady and deliberate, and Setsuna felt a chill race up her spine as a calm, damningly familiar voice spoke up from off camera. Tell us about Strike Team Valkyrie, Agent Kurihara. It was a covert special ops squad tasked with liquidating high-risk targets, Daisuke blurted in a forced, automatic tone, squeezing his eyes shut as his mouth continued to move involuntarily. We reported directly to Safety Commission leadership. They gave us assignments that were too inflammatory to risk exposing to the public. Full deniability, no traceable records, god damn it. Of course they have a double of Nemoto Shin. The president's hands curled into fists as her stoic aura finally gave way to anger. Pivoting on a dime, she held up her radio in an ice grip, her knuckles white around the receiver. Kengan illegal. I need a team to get on the phone with every single network broadcasting this thing. They're going to take it down, immediately. I don't care how much they whine, this video is a threat to national security, and we have the legal right to prosecute them if they don't comply. Make sure they are all well aware of that. All the while, though, the stream continued to play on the monitor overhead, mocking Kengan's fury with each passing second of Kurihara's forced confession. And what was your role on this Strike Team Valkyrie? I came on as part of the cleanup crew after our missions erasing evidence, disposing of bodies, pinning the casualties on accidents or local villains. After a year, I joined the interrogation unit. Progress, Kengan snapped, practically burning a hole through Mira's head with the intensity of her glare. She'd begun to pace back and forth at the front of the room.
Twice, Shigaraki roared. Come out where I can't see you. He doesn't take orders from you anymore. The air in the room seemed to take on an unnatural chill as a third figure stepped through the door, or perhaps that was simply a side effect of all the blood loss. Either way, Tomura shivered as he looked up to the shadowy outline of the one who had taken everything from him. None of them take orders from you anymore. He stepped forward, coming to halt, at the edge of a patch of sunlight filtering in from the window above them, his body half within it and half without. The sleek black exoskeleton he wore as armor gleamed in the dappled light, and Tomura grimaced as he recalled what it could do. At first glance it looked like no more than a strangely textured, slightly angular bodysuit complemented by a matching mask, but Shigaraki knew well that its appearance was deceiving. It was made of jointed plates of high-tensile carbon fiber, as light as cloth and as hard as diamond, with hidden servomotors and impact absorbers in the arms and legs to give his punches and kicks the force to break through walls and shatter bones. The armor retracted half a moment later, though folding into its case on its owner's back, revealing a white shirt and dark blazer, and hands tipped by gloves of elegant black leather. He had gone by various aliases in his steady, 2-year rise from nothing to the top of Japan's villain hierarchy. Ringleader, Rainmaker, Silencer. Shigaraki had known his true identity all along though. Midoriya Izuku. Tomura grit out the name like it was poison. So you've come to kill me after all this time at my heels? Will that finally satisfy you to have trampled everything I worked for into the dirt once, and for all? No. A shadow of a grin playing about his lips, Midoriya took another step forward. Now fully in the sunlight, much like his armor, his face was disarming. At first it appeared to be a simple high school boy's countenance, freckled and youthful, with a wild tangle of green and black hair. But there was something dark and unsettling in Izuku's eyes, something broken. His gaze pierced straight through Shigaraki, as he stood looming above him, his hands clasped behind his back. No, it won't satisfy me. But it's a decent start. I'd like to say this is all nothing personal, but that would be a lie. He advanced toward Tomura again, unclasping his hands, and hanging them at his sides as they slowly balled into fists. You insulted me, Shigaraki. Do you remember? You called me weak, and I couldn't let a lie like that stand. I had to demonstrate that I was stronger than you because I knew I was even then. He broke into a wide smile. And now I have. Survival of the fittest is the only universal law, Tomura, and I'm the survivor. From the very beginning, you were the weak one. I didn't even need a quirk to beat you. Tomura groaned softly as more blood leaked from his stomach, remembering how a quirkless boy had shown up on the league's doorstep 2 years ago, angry and ambitious and bitter at the world. How he'd laughed and thrown him out. You're of no use to us, Shigaraki had said, turning away and drawing the door shut behind him. Run along now before I get angry. Over the past few months, he had replayed that moment in his mind times beyond count. And do you know why I didn't need one? Midoriya spread out his arms and gestured to his followers. more of whom were filtering into the room with each passing moment. Twice and Spinner, Dobby and Mustard, a few more he didn't even recognize, watching his defeat with amusement. Because I lead people, not command them. Because I give them a plan to follow, and ideals to strive for. Because I would defend them to my last breath, just as they would defend me. Because they know that no matter the odds, I can't find a way to win. Chapter 30, Sound and Fury. So what do you think I should go for? I've always been a fan of macarons, but their eclairs and chocolate croissants look amazing. Jiro glanced up from the cafe's menu with an eager expression on her face. If you get an eclair, maybe we could split it, and I'd give you half of my croissant. Of course, their eclairs are to die for, particularly the one with pistachio cream filling. Yaoyo Rozu Momo smiled, and glanced around for their waiter. In the warm spring weather, the cafe's outdoor garden patio felt like paradise. She'd been coming to this place for years, ever since her parents first brought her as a child. Every item on the menu, every variety of plant in the neatly maintained flower beds ringing the cobblestone seating area, Momo knew them all by heart. They were currently seated at a table for two beautiful wrought iron decorated with Baroque patterns, and overhead, a large canvas umbrella provided shade from the bright midday sun. A handful of other patrons were chatting quietly a few tables away, but for the most part, they had the patio to themselves, all the better for their celebration. What were we celebrating again? Ah, there he is, shaking her head to clear the fog. Yaoyo Rozu raised a hand, and waved politely at their handsome young waiter as he passed them by. Hello sir, 1 pistachio eclair, and 1 pain au chocolate, and to drink, gold tips imperial for us both. That's not what I was gonna order. Once the waiter had walked away, Kyoka gave her a confused glance. What's a pan au whatever it was? You trying to surprise me or something? Yao Momo. Pain au chocolate is the proper name for a chocolate croissant. In the original French, Momo gave Kyoko a playful grin, then reached up to straighten her ponytail. I studied the language a bit. Back in middle school it was the pastries at this cafe that sparked my curiosity. In fact, last year, father even allowed me to accompany him on a business trip to Bordeaux. He owns some vineyards in the area, and I was able to tour them with him. It was a truly wonderful experience. That's amazing. I've always wanted to go to Paris. That's where my parents had their honeymoon. Jiro paused, and took a sip from her china teacup. When did the tea get here? Momo glanced down, confused. There was a full cup of tea in front of her as well. And the steaming kettle had been placed on the table between them. Next to it, their pastries were sitting on an ornate silver tray. I must have been distracted talking to Kyoka when he brought it all out. Why don't you speak some French for me? Jiro asked, a grin on her face as she took a bite of her pain au chocolate and took a moment to chew and swallow. I bet you're great at it after spending some time there. Brushing aside her previous concerns, Momo returned the grin, unable to resist the chance to showcase some of her speaking skills. Oh, I'm still just a beginner? But if you insist. Momo took a long sip of tea and paused to clear her throat. Flushing slightly with embarrassment, she rarely spoke French with anyone other than her parents. Kyoka, ma chérie ta tenu estate presque aussi belle que toi. Sounds like you studied it more than a bit. Jiro clapped her hands together and then landed a light, teasing punch on Yaoyo Rozu's arm. Look at you being modest again. Your French must be even better than Aoyama's. So what did you say? Her smile widened in anticipation. Oh, I was simply complimenting your outfit, Momo replied, turning back to her tea with a self-satisfied expression. Kyoka was as fashionable as ever today with a stylish leather jacket, matching boots, and a dark purple skirt. For her own part, Momo was wearing an floral pattern sundress, one of her favorites from her mother's wardrobe. But if you'd like, maybe I can't teach you a bit. What? Is she showing off again? A chuckle sounded off to their right, and Momo turned to find Kendo Itsuka and Todoroki Shoto stepping out onto the patio from the cafe's main building, both dressed in casual clothes. Try not to feed her ego too much, Jiro. Itsuka gave them both a wink, a grin on her face. Sorry we're late, Shoto offered, smiling softly as the two new arrivals took a seat on the other end of the table for 4. We ended up on the same train here. For 4, weren't we at? A table for 2. Midway through a bite of eclair, Yaoyo Rozu hesitated for a moment before replying, but Kendo's voice quickly snapped her out of her confusion. Glad we could make it though. I wouldn't miss this for the world. Itsuka sipped from her teacup, smiling eagerly. You ready for our next commercial shoot with Uwabami tomorrow? Of course, I can't wait. It may not be the type of traditional hero work I was expecting from this work study, but experiencing it together is what makes it tolerable. Yaoyo Rozu reached out and gave Kendo's hand a squeeze. If you weren't there with me, I don't think I would have survived the first day. Trust me, same here. It would have been so much more intimidating without you. Yaoyo Rozu, you've got a bit of. Off to her right, Todoroki suddenly leaned in and lifted a hand up to her face. A bit of pastry, right here. Before Momo could even process what was happening, Shoto was dutifully brushing away a few crumbs of eclair clinging to the side of her mouth, seemingly oblivious to just how close the two of them had grown. There, it's gone now. When their eyes met a moment later, both their cheeks flushed bright red in the same instant, and Shoto swiftly leaned away again. My apologies if that wasn't proper. Oh man, do we need to get you to a room? Kyoka only barely managed to stifle a giggle, and beside her Itsuka was clearly having trouble holding back her laughter as well. You just let us know if you want us to move to another table. Their reactions only served to worsen Momo's already severe embarrassment. It took her several moments, and a great deal of willpower to compose a coherent response. No, I assure you you've misinterpreted the situation. Todoroki was simply being a gentleman, you mustn't. The pleasant orchestral swell of her cell phone's ringtone interrupted Momo's panicked explanation. It was tucked away in her handbag, hung over the side of her chair. I should have known to turn it on vibrate before I met with friends. Whoever it is, I'm sure they can wait. Electing to let the call go to voicemail, Yaoyo Rozu turned back and continued to chat amiably with the others, enduring Jiro and Kendo's persistent teasing about Todoroki the best she could. Not a minute later, though, the ringtone sounded again, and Momo paused mid-sip of tea, frowning.
Syndicate Headquarters, Nagoya. Yaoyo Rozu's eyes were wet with tears when she jerked upright in her bed, gasping for breath. The sensations from the dream had all felt searingly vivid and real. Both of Momo's hands shot instinctively to her neck, feeling the skin to check for bruises and make sure she could still breathe. It was a dream, she whispered, wiping at her tears as she propped herself up against the backboard of the bed. Just a dream, nothing to be. Momo paused and choked out a soft sob. Try as she might to forget the images, Jiro, Kendo, and Todoroki's faces were still burned in her mind the way they looked at me like I was pure irredeemable filth. That's probably how they think of me now, isn't it? The ending of the dream had been a construct of her mind, of course, but the conversations toward the beginning were all drawn from reality. The placement was out of context, but the pain of the experience was made all more acute by the fact that the memories were at least partially genuine. I still remember explaining pain AU chocolate to Kyoka like it was yesterday, during breakfast, after a sleepover at my parents' mansion. The bit with Todoroki cleaning food off my mouth happened during lunch in the UA cafeteria, but it happened nonetheless. And Kendo, Yaoyo Rozu shook her head in frustration as memories of the week they spent together with Uwabami filled her mind. Even after the work study ended, they'd remained close friends until her abduction. Pull yourself together, you pathetic, whimpering child. Her eyes narrowing in anger, Momo slapped herself hard across the face. The tears came to a stop shortly after. They'll never understand what you're doing for them, but you must do it all the same. You have something they lack: the strength to make the sacrifices necessary to save this nation. A sigh escaped her chest, and she reached up to wipe a sheen of sweat from her brow before clapping her hands together. Her bedroom lights came to life a moment later, starting out dim and gradually brightening to normal level. Brahms, Pandora declared, wiping any remaining traces of wetness from her cheeks as swung her feet out over the edge of her massive, queen-size bed and slid on a pair of velvet slippers. String Sextet No. 1 in B-flat major. Once she'd risen to her feet, Momo reached down to brush a stray wrinkle out of her lush, silken lavender nightgown, and smiled softly as the music she'd selected began to play from a speaker on her bedside table. Midoriya had been generous enough to gift her one of the largest bedrooms in their Nagoya headquarters. Ironically, it was the same room they first kept her restrained in over 2 years ago after they retrieved her from the forest training camp. I was so stubborn then, so sentimental, so willfully blind to this society's most fundamental flaws. Momo scowled, shaking her head as she created 2 aspirin pills in her palm. Her forehead was throbbing with a sudden headache, and acetylsalicylic acid was one of the first few medicinal compounds she'd mastered. That dream was nothing more than a relic of those days, an attempt by some rebellious fragment of my mind to drag me back into blissful ignorance. I need to be stronger, to grow more resistant to this lingering weakness. I won't be swayed by illusions of petty sentimentality, Pandora reassured herself, her hands clenching into fists. My mission is far too important to be compromised by something so foolish. Momo reached up and tossed the pills into her mouth, then produced a gout of water from her palm to wash them down. As long as she had fuel for her quirk, she could never go thirsty, given the simplicity of water's molecular structure. By producing the molecules closer together or farther apart, she could create ice and steam as well, though the latter came with the risk of burning her skin without proper precautions. I had one half of Todoroki's quirk mastered by the time I was in grade school. Momo reflected she'd largely refrained from Kurogiri portal. Now, it wasn't supposed to be this way, Shigaraki thought to himself as he ducked under a barrage of fire and bullets and dove through a pulsing purple warp gate, landing clumsily on his knees on another floor of the same decrepit warehouse. The ragged screams and roars of his Nomu echoed throughout the building. After almost a year of non-stop running and fighting, they were the last ones left, the strongest and the hardiest. But even they stood little chance. All they could do was buy him time as he looked for a way out. This can't be how my story ends. I have to make it to the next level. Wincing as blood began to drip from a shallow wound on his shoulder where one of Spinner's blades had grazed him, he forced himself to his feet and turned to Kurogiri, who stood panting at his side. They're right below us, and the Nomu can only buy so much time. Is this really the best you can do? Kurogiri straightened up, batting at patches of singed, still smoking fabric on his trademark blazer. Just moments prior, he'd nearly been engulfed by one of Dabi's attacks. I told you there's some sort of dampening field surrounding the building. I can't generate portals anywhere outside this warehouse, but it would take a tremendous amount of power to restrict my quirk like this over an area so large. They either have someone new who can specifically counteract me, or they're using some sort of electromagnetic field generator. So we find the quirk user, or we find the machine, Tomura gritted, his fist clenched. Then we can't get out of here. Regroup. Regroup. He almost laughed aloud when the word left his mouth. What group? A year ago the League of Villains had been swelling with talent under his undisputed command, with new recruits flowing in constantly, even when they were periodically forced to scatter and hide from police and hero investigations for months at a time. How quickly they'd abandoned him, all except a scant few. Twice, and Dabi, Toga, and Magna, no one has spared him the pain of betrayal, flocking to a rising new power within the world of villains like moths to a flame, eager to bow and scrape and bend the knee before the specter that had been hunting him relentlessly for over 10 months now. Muscular and Moonfish, the last faithful holdouts from the height of his power, had both been killed escaping the last hideout, and now only Kurogiri and the Nomu were left. For how much longer, though? His enemies had found a way to defeat even the most powerful of the genetically engineered beasts, if their disastrous last encounter in Yokohama was any clue, and now it seemed that they could nullify Kurogiri's ward gate as well. Even the doctor had cut off all contact with him.